Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. This week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 8, where we are going to look at death investigations. And we have quite a bit of content to cover and a lot of definitions that we're going to need to cover. So I want to go ahead and just jump right into the lecture. So here we go. So first, I would like to have you look at this picture. And as you look at this picture, look at it from a detective standpoint, from an investigatory standpoint. If you were called out to this crime scene and your job is going to be to determine what happened. Was it a homicide? Was it a suicide? Was it accidental? And as you start to look at the picture in more detail, start to kind of gather up in your mind the different clues, the different types of physical evidence that you see, things that appear to be ordinary and those that appear to be out of the ordinary. Very quick examples could be the large blood stain against the wall, the fact that the individual has a firearm in their hand, the fact that they're holding a cigarette in this hand. Is it lit or is it out, and is this one lit? So if they're both lit, could there have been two people in the room? Was the person standing or sitting at the time of when they were shot? Were they shot right here? And if they were sitting, why is the stool over here? Why is there only one flip-flop? Was one taken from the scene? Does it even belong to the deceased person in the picture? What is this note right here? Are these the individuals? Do they wear glasses? Just a lot of different things that you need to consider. Is there any other type of evidence? There's a soda can right here. Can we get DNA or fingerprints off of any of this? You know, where is the point of entry? Was it a door that we don't see in this photo, obviously? Or could it have been through the window? Or is this window locked? Or does it appear to be? Again, a lot of things to consider as we start to go through this chapter on death investigation. And you can always come back to this picture and look at it in more detail if you want. Okay, so statistically, murder is the least significant of the violent crimes, yet it receives extensive media attention. And when we talk about violent crimes, we mean like, murder, rape, robbery, etc. So those are the violent crimes. So murder is the least in terms of numbers, yet it receives the most attention. And this type of crime may appear to be occurring more frequently, but actually it's been declining over the last many years, actually. And males are most often the victims and the suspects in homicides, and in addition, males are 10 times more likely to commit murder than are females. And they also do it differently. So if you were to take a criminology class, which is a great class when it talks about, not only how crimes are committed, but kind of the mind, the criminal mind, you'll see that females tend to commit murders in a different way. So it's actually kind of a cool class to take. So, think about that one. That's actually a great one. Oh, and by the way, it's AJ112 for anyone that might want to consider that. Okay. So with that said, we know, again, as I said, that homicides, murders have been statistically dropping over the years. I do have an interesting thing for you to look at. This is the FBI crime clock. And the FBI every year publishes not only basic crime statistics covering what we call Part 1 crimes, which are these types of crimes right here. These are the property crimes. and these are the person crimes. So they publish these every year. Every police department throughout the United States is required to publish their crime statistics per year. And then every year, the FBI, not only do they publish those statistics, but they publish certain aspects of them as well. And this crime clock is kind of cool because it's not the amount of each type of crime, it's the frequency. So if you take a look, in 2018, there was one murder every 32.5 minutes across the United States. That's actually kind of scary, right? I mean, it's even worse when you look down here. There's a property crime that's committed every 4.4 seconds. And when you think of it like that, it does kind of make you freak out a little bit. But this is a crime clock. And then if you're ever wondering, well, where do the most homicides happen every year? So using that same year, 2018, among large cities, St. Louis in 2018 had 60.9 homicides per 100,000 residents. Okay, and then finally, before we jump into the meat of our lecture, you're going to basically encounter different types of homicides. You know, every investigation is unique. There's always a little bit of a twist, especially in the investigative process, and maybe even how the homicide is committed. So here's a very interesting case, a case of sleepwalking homicide, or at least that's the defense of sleepwalking. So this is the Scott Falater case. So if you have a chance, take a look at that. It's actually a very interesting case study. Okay, so kind of jumping in, there are 5 categories of death: natural, accidental, suicide, homicide, which has 2 subcategories, criminal and non-criminal, and then undetermined, meaning that it could not be determined because it didn't fall into these categories right here, or at least they couldn't determine that it could, if that makes sense. So natural causes of death include things like heart attacks, strokes, fatal diseases, pneumonia, sudden crib death, and even old age. And frequently, a person who dies of natural causes has been under a doctor's care, and therefore it's going to be a little bit easier to establish because you can get in touch with the doctor and find out that, yes, they had this disease and they've been under my care. So it's going to be a little bit easier to determine the cause of death. But consider that sometimes a death is made to look as though it resulted from natural causes when it didn't. So, again, an example could be that drugs that stimulate, or simulate the effects of a heart attack may be used to, cover up a suicide or a homicide, right? So you can't just take everything at first blush or first glance. You have to really be objective and kind of open your mind and look at all of the aspects. So accidental. Among the leading cases of accidental deaths are falling, drowning, unintentionally taking too much medication, because if you intentionally did it, it might fall into a different category, right? Ingesting a poisonous substance, industrial accidents, auto, boat, train, or plane crashes. Now, also keep in mind, since we're talking about accidental, some accidental death cases need to be investigated like a homicide. And the example would be a fatal traffic collision. What if somebody was severely impaired? So it wasn't just a standard accident. There may actually be a different cause for that. So you're going to investigate these fatal crashes just like you would a homicide. And hopefully that makes sense. Sometimes an individual could actually succumb to a heart attack while they're driving, which could cause them to become involved in a fatal crash. So that's why, again, a lot of times fatal traffic collisions are investigated just like you would a homicide, so you could determine exactly how it happened. Suicides. By definition, the intentional taking of one's own life. And suicide can be accomplished in many different ways. Shooting, stabbing, hanging, poisoning, burning, asphyxiating, or ingesting drugs. Now, keep in mind, a lot of times, many homicides are made to look like suicides. And that probably, you can understand why, right? If somebody commits a suicide, they're going to want to, or someone commits a homicide, they're going to want to make it look like a suicide so the investigation stops right there. If the detectives come in and they go, oh, it's a suicide, well, then there's no further investigation, so that person will get away with the homicide. So that statement really does make sense. Many suicides also are made to look like accidents. So why do you think that is? Well, I mean, there could be a couple of reasons. Usually it could be for, let's say, insurance purposes, or to ease the family suffering or stigma. So they don't want to, let people know that maybe one of their family members committed suicide, so they might make it look like an accident. As I said before, insurance. A lot of times the insurance companies won't pay an insurance policy as a result of a suicide, so they make it look like an accident. Okay, so one more thing relating to suicides. Although suicide is not a criminal offense in most states, it is a crime to attempt to commit suicide. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And again, it's different from states to state, but let's look at one other aspect. It may also be a crime to help someone commit or attempt to commit suicide by either intentionally advising, encouraging, or actually assisting the victim in the act. And the topic of assisted suicide, it's very controversial. The Supreme Court has found that there is no constitutional right to die, and therefore has left this decision to each individual state. Now, one high-profile figure in this controversy is a person by the name of Jack Kevorkian. They called him Dr. Death. He was a pathologist turned assisted suicide, kind of a crusader type guy, who facilitated more than 130 suicides back in the 1990s. And after being tried multiple times on assisted suicide charges, he was eventually tried for murder. He was found guilty and sent to prison in 1999. He was later paroled in 2007, and he died in 2011. So again, you have all these different aspects. So you have to look at these different things, especially, you go back to the picture that I showed you at the beginning. So you have to figure out really what happened. Okay, so homicide. Now this is going to be a little more technical, so you're going to need to really pay close attention, because some of these subcategories are going to have subcategories. But it's okay. You guys are all super smart, so you're going to get it. So if another individual is the direct or indirect cause of the death is classified as a homicide. So by definition, homicide is the killing of one person by another. And it's going to be broken into two different smaller subcategories. So it's either criminal or non-criminal. So criminal homicide is going to be even subdivided further. So let me kind of just stop right here. So we know here, homicide is the killing of one person by another, and it's broken down into criminal or non-criminal. Okay, we've got that. Now, criminal homicide is even broken down further into murder and manslaughter. And both of those are also going to be broken down further. But I'll show you a little chart that's going to help you out. Okay, non-criminal homicide is also subdivided into two other categories, excusable and justifiable. So one more time, homicide, the killing of one person by another, is broken into criminal and non-criminal. Okay, that makes sense. Criminal homicide, that one little subcategory, is subdivided further into murder or manslaughter. And non-criminal homicide is subdivided into excusable and justifiable. I think you got it. So keep this in mind as well. Murder and homicide are not synonymous, meaning that they're not the same. Because all murders are homicides and criminal, but not all homicides are murders or criminals. So again, kind of an interesting thing. All right, so we've talked a little bit about these other little definitions and stuff, these subcategories. So let's define them. So what is murder then? So murder is the killing of another human being with malice aforethought. Okay, and it is the most severe statutory crime, one of the few for which the penalty can be life imprisonment or death. Now, in some states, the crimes of treason and kidnapping for ransom might have those same penalties. So murder has 3 different degrees. So first-degree murder requires what we call premeditation or advanced planning and the intent to cause death. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And in your textbook on page 274, there's a little chart that kind of outlines everything that we're talking about, these definitions and how they kind of fall sequentially. Second-degree murder includes the intent to cause death, but without the premeditation. So hopefully that makes sense. So first degree, again, requires that advanced planning, that premeditation, and the intent to cause death. And second degree includes the intent, but not that premeditation. And then some states, but not all, have third degree. And third degree murder involves neither premeditation nor intent. It results from an act that is immediately dangerous to others, an act that might show a disregard for human life. Things like maybe shooting into a room where people are likely to be present, or playing a practical joke on somebody that might result in that person's death. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so remember we talked about how those things were broken down. Remember we talked about how criminal homicide was broken down to murder and manslaughter. Okay, so let's kind of go further with some definitions. So then what is manslaughter? So manslaughter is the unlawful killing of another person with no prior malice, and it may be voluntary and or involuntary. So you can see that manslaughter kind of even breaks it down just a little bit more too. So you've got these subcategories that are like further subcategories. So voluntary manslaughter is the intentional causing of a death of another person in the heat of passion or words that provoke such a response. So an example could be acts of adultery, or let's say you walked in on on your spouse and a heat of passion, and you kind of just freaked out and you got so worked up. that you did something to them, and as a result, they died. Does that kind of make sense? So intentional causing of a death of another person in the heat of passion. And then involuntary manslaughter. This is an accidental homicide that results from, let's say, extreme negligence, something like playing with a firearm or something like that, the handling of a firearm, or maybe leaving poison out where children have the ability to take it. So those are some examples. And then we have the other two. Okay, remember we talked about those that were non-criminal. So remember we went to classification of homicides. We had criminal, and we talked about murder and manslaughter. We finished that. And now we have non-criminal, and they have the subcategories of excusable and justifiable. So here we go. So excusable homicide results from an act that normally would not cause death, or from an act committed with ordinary caution. That's because of the victim's negligence results in death. So that would be excusable. And then justifiable would be killing in self-defense or in the defense of others. Law enforcement, times of war, even executions. So these would be excusable. Okay, so I know it sounds like there was a lot that we kind of covered, but we made it through. And to help you, I have a chart. Now, this is from California, but it'll kind of help you understand it. So when you think of these death investigations, think of homicide as the umbrella. Homicide is not a crime in itself. It's descriptive of the acts that fall underneath it. So remember we talked about classifications of homicide, and we talked about murder. So on this side, here's the murder. And these are, the unlawful ones, right? Okay, so we have murder here. And then we have manslaughter over here. So it's under the umbrella of homicide. And these are the, again, they're unlawful. These are worse, so murder is worse. And then we have the manslaughter sections. And then we have the non-criminal ones, the, kind of lawful, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And that's right here. And that's justifiable and excusable. So does that make sense? Homicide's the umbrella. Murder, which is unlawful. Manslaughter, which is unlawful. And then we have the, the non-criminal, which is excusable and justifiable. So there you go. So maybe hopefully that chart kind of helped you a little bit. All right, so now we got to just kind of keep going. So the last death or classification of death that we want to go over is what they call undetermined. Or could not be determined. And this is where, or it's used when information pointing to one manner of death is no more compelling than one or more other manners of death. So we just can't figure it out. Now, a lot of times investigators and the coroner's office, they don't want to use this classification, but every once in a while it just doesn't fit under any other classification. So that's undetermined. Okay, so we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk about elements of the crime, because it's important as an investigator that you understand the elements of a crime, because you're going to, if you make an arrest of a person involved in someone's death, you're going to have to establish these elements to prosecute them. So, laws on criminal homicide vary significantly from state to state, but certain common elements are usually found in each. So the degree eventually charged is decided by the prosecuting attorney based on the available evidence. And in your textbook at the top of page 275 talks about some of the different elements that need to be proven. So one important element, though, is going to be what we call premeditation. But here's an example. The only difference between first and second degree murder is the element of premeditation. So if the attorney cannot find proof of premeditation, the case is going to be filed as a second degree murder. So remember, first degree requires that premeditation, right? So how can we establish premeditation? That's an element of the crime of first degree murder. So we have to be able to establish that. So premeditation is the consideration, the planning or preparation for an act, no matter how briefly, before the act is committed. And laws use such terms like premeditated design to kill or malice aforethought. So they're whatever the law's wording, it is necessary to prove some intention and plan to commit the crime before it was actually committed. So by definition, again, the consideration, the planning or preparation for an act, no matter how brief, before committing the act. And that's an important element of first degree murder. Okay, so what about intent? Again, and we're talking about elements of crimes. And again, if you go back to that, there's a chart on page 275. If you look at the top, it'll talk about each one of these little subcategories that we're going over. So now let's talk about intent. So intent is a required element of most categories of criminal homicide. Criminal intent is purposely performing an unlawful act, knowing the act to be illegal. And evidence must be shown that the crime was intentional, not accidental. So that's criminal intent. Now, malicious intent is an element of first and second degree murder, and it implies ill will or wickedness or cruelty. So how the act was committed shows the degree of intent, the type of weapon used, how and when it was acquired, and how the suspect and victim came together will also help prove the intent as well as the act that caused the death. So hopefully that makes sense as well. So an intent is another important element. Heat of passion. I think I briefly talked about that. This element is the alternative to premeditations. And it assumes that the act was committed when the suspect suddenly became extremely emotional, thus eliminating, right, or precluding the premeditation. You didn't have time to think about it and plan it. So hopefully that kind of helps. So heat of passion results from arguments between people, or from, let's say, seeing someone victimized, or you walk in again, like I talked about, on your other half, or discovery of adultery, let's say, and you get so emotional about it, you don't have time to think, you just act. And that would be under heat of passion. Some other elements of crimes would be things like culpable negligence, or a word that we call depravity. So the act and the way it was committed or is committed will establish this type of element. And the act must be so dangerous that any prudent person would see death of a person as a possible consequence. So that's kind of negligence. So a fine line separates, we're talking about negligence now, a fine line separates this element from the culpable negligence, that preceding element that we just talked about. Some states make no distinction, classifying both in a separate category of criminal negligence. Where separate categories exist, this lesser degree of negligence invokes creating a situation that results in an unreasonable risk of death or great bodily injury. So the one that's a little bit of a higher level, would be culpable negligence. Again, it's the act so dangerous that any prudent person would see death as a result, versus just negligence in itself, which is creating a situation that results in a unreasonable risk of death or bodily injury. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the challenges. We're going to get more into the investigative part. But we had to kind of learn a lot of the terms and different types of crimes before we could move into this particular part, because as we're investigating, we have to know where it fits. So with that said, what are some challenges? So police have an obligation to act on the behalf of the deceased and their families. And they are expected to conduct a professional investigation to identify, arrest, and prosecute suspects. And among the numerous challenges officers encounter in homicide investigations are pressure by the media and the public, the difficulty in establishing homicide rather than suicide or accidental or natural death, being able to identify the victim, and establishing the cause and time of death. And other challenges are obtaining witness cooperation and even protecting the crime scene when emergency medical personnel are working on individuals. And homicides create high interest in the community, as evidenced by increase, when you watch the news or websites, you get all those hits and all of that information. And indeed, the media has a special interest in police investigations of any type of death, accidental or otherwise. So police officers who have dealt with the news media understand the importance, or that relationship between law enforcement and the media. And those are some of the things that we actually talked about back in chapter 1. So again, when we talk about media, it's kind of all over the place. And here's just a couple of news clips, if you will, that I found off the internet that you can look at about, the different types of shooting deaths that are happening. And those that are leading these organizations that get out in front of the media and talk about these things. So there are a lot of challenges, and there is a lot of media hype. Okay, so again, as we start looking at challenges and investigations, let's start to dive into the different types of things. So we're going to talk now about the interpretation as we go through these investigations. So we're going to start with something called equivocal death. So an equivocal death investigations are situations that are open to interpretation. The case may present as a homicide, a suicide, or even an accidental death. And the facts may be intentionally vague or misleading, as in staged crime scenes. So this is the equivocal death. Again, remember I told you that, look at that picture at the very beginning that I showed you. there's probably a couple of different ways that you could see this type of investigation. So these equivocal death investigations are those situations that they're kind of open to interpretation. So like for this type of situation, you could just jump right in and say, okay, this looks like a suicide. But you have to examine all of the evidence. Is it a suicide or is it a staged suicide? Did somebody make it look like that? Is it actually a homicide? And they made it look like a suicide. So you're going to have to look at all of the different aspects. I mean, this is quite a bit of trouble to go to, right? Is this a note on the ground? Is it a suicide note? Look for other physical evidence. So, sometimes things, you have to have that objective mind as you look at these different situations. So a staged crime scene is one where a killer hopes to cover his or her tracks by making it look like the victim may have committed suicide, suffered a fatal accident, or died as the result of natural causes. Now, inexperienced investigators, again, who jump into an investigation hastily, might find that they may be, they may be wrong. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at something, that you're really diving into the details. So what you don't want to do is hastily draw a conclusion that a person found hanging in their garage, or someone that was found in the bathtub with a slit wrist. Oh well, they must have committed suicide. So that's what it looks like to me. And then somebody gets away with murder. So you really want to take your time. So another quick distinction. There is a distinction that exists between posing and staging as it relates to crime scenes. Posing refers to positioning of the body only. Staging refers to the manipulation of the scene around the body in addition to posing of the body. So just understand that there's a couple of different ways that those terms are different. And a critical piece of investigation is also assessing the victimology, the collection of significant and relevant information related to a victim and that victim's lifestyle. And that's going to be important because it helps investigators develop and ascertain suspects' motives and even risk factors. So again, it's going to be really, really important. Their personality, employment, education, friends, habits, hobbies, marital status, relationship, dating history, sexuality, reputation, criminal history, alcohol or drugs, physical condition, and even the neighborhood of the residents are all pieces that comprise victimology. So it's really important that you take the time to look at all of the aspects to help you figure out what happened. Now, when we're investigating suicide, it often presents as a homicide, and investigators need to keep in mind more Americans die by suicide than homicide. Often depression or schizophrenia is involved, and usually these individuals have made their intentions known to somebody else. Therefore, investigators should really do their due diligence to determine whether a suspected suicide victim was suffering from mental illness, or whether the victim had talked to anyone about committing suicide, because that's going to help you determine whether something was actually a suicide, right? And the reason for an apparent suicide must be determined. An act that appears to be too violent for suicide and is therefore a suspected homicide may actually be a natural death. So never exclude the possibility of death from natural causes in the initial phase of an investigation because of the presence of obvious marks of violence. So, I mean, there's just a lot there. So, again, you really have to, kind of look at the big picture. Check for weapons, near the body. Be aware that a weapon may be underneath the body and noticeable only after the body has been moved. Learn whether the victim was left or right-handed and see whether that fits with the method of committing the suicide, like in the picture that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture. Couple other things to note. Note lividity conditions, and we'll talk about what that is in a little bit, and the body's location to determine how long the person has been dead and whether the body has been moved. Note the condition of something called rigor mortis, and we'll talk about that. Are there hesitation marks indicating indecision before the final act? Hesitation marks might be as somebody maybe cuts themselves. They don't really want to cut themselves, so they're kind of hesitating. So they're just little marks. Again, check for letters or notes. Check the victim's phone or computer. There's just a lot of things, a lot of facts to consider. Think about this. What appears to be a double suicide could also present problems. It may be a murder-suicide. So determine who died first or who inflicted the fatal wound. Attempt to determine the motive. Search for a note, kind of like the note that I have up on the screen right now. Look for signs of a violent struggle before death. Sometimes suicide is obvious, as when suspects kill themselves to avoid being captured by police. And again, to gain a better understanding of the victim's frame of mind when a suicide occurred, or to reveal that the act was perhaps not suicide, it wasn't a suicide at all, think victimology. Investigators must examine the personality traits, the character, the lifestyle of the victim, reconstructing it as accurately as possible the days and hours preceding the person's death. So just a lot for us to look at. And as you look at these photos, think about, initially, does it look like a suicide, a homicide, or can you even really tell? Now, of course, this has already been partially investigated because you can see in this picture the individual's hands are bagged. But you can note right here, this is a firearm found right in the middle. So this picture should really make you think. So, just kind of finishing up, I'll show you a couple of other pictures, but think about how these scenes look. Are they just straight out suicides? So, here's a unique thing. Look on the wall back here in this case. You have two areas that appear to have spatter. Okay, it's not splatter, it's spatter. And you've got this individual with two guns in his hand. Is that kind of normal? I mean, so, again, you have these crime scenes that you're going to walk up and you're going to go, And then some of them might be a little bit easier to determine, right? I mean, so this one is a little bit easier, but don't just assume anything. Okay, so, again, look at the big picture. So before we get into this next section, just one final word on suicide. Although some suicides occur without any outward warning, most people who are contemplating suicide, they do tend to display some noticeable signs. And some of those are listed on page 279, so you can look at those if you want. And then there are some other aspects of suicide. Something called suicide by police, where the individual, and we talked a little bit about this in chapter 7, this is a situation where a person decides that he or she wants to die, but they don't want to pull the trigger themselves. And such individuals may lack the constitution or the will to take their own lives. Therefore, they choose instead the option of forcing a police officer to do it. Or they may even view suicide as socially or even religiously unacceptable, but they believe that if they're killed by law enforcement, that stigma of suicide will be averted. And then society might actually view them as a victim. And as we said before, some insurance policies, they won't pay a person if they commit suicide, making suicide by cop kind of an attractive option. We also have suicide by law enforcement. There is no question that police work is stressful and it can take its toll in very tragic ways. And although many consider police work to be dangerous or a dangerous profession, primarily because of the risk of encountering violent and armed individuals, a lot of officers lose their lives. Actually, more officers tend to lose their lives to suicide than to homicide. And to give you kind of a quick picture of that, according to some data that was released by Blue Help, this is an organization that tracks police officer suicides. There were 228 American police officers that died by suicide in 2019. And that's easily double the amount that were killed by homicide. Okay. So, and I have a video. If you want to watch an actual suicide by police confrontation, you can see it there. All right, so let's jump now into the preliminary investigative portion of the lecture. So the homicide scene, without a doubt, is the most important scene to which a police officer or investigator will be called upon to respond to. And because of the nature of these calls, the answer to what actually happened can be determined only through a careful and intelligent examination of the scene. So it's important that we do this carefully and we really take a thorough look. So the homicide case normally begins with a report of a missing person or the discovery of a body. And the officer in the field typically will make that first initial discovery. Now, an important case law for us to know is one that's called Flippo versus West Virginia. And in this case, the Supreme Court held that police may make warrantless entries onto premises where they reasonably believe that a person is in need of immediate aid, or may make a prompt warrantless search of a homicide scene for other victims or a killer on the premises. Now, the court also, in this same case, rejected the idea that there is any type of general murder scene exception to the search warrant requirement of the Fourth Amendment. But this case does give you the ability to aid a person if you believe someone is in immediate need of aid, or search a homicide scene for other victims or a suspect. So that's an important case law to remember. So as you enter the scene, it is important to introduce yourself, identify key personnel, and assess the safety of the scene. The first priority is to make sure the scene is safe and to protect yourself, others, and the victim from further danger by a suspect who might still be at the scene and able to cause more harm. So, you want to make sure you take care of that. Then the second priority is to render aid to the victim, making sure that an ambulance is en route. If the suspect is still at the scene, those priorities might differ a little bit. So again, your first priority is making the scene safe for everyone, and second is to render aid. And the reason that rendering aid is second is you can't help anybody if the scene's not safe. All right. And along with that, the first officer on the scene is going to determine the path to the victim that will least disturb the evidence. And that officer will also, either him or herself and others, will tape off the crime scene. So if the victim in this case, though, is obviously deceased, you're going to leave the body there. The body is going to remain at the scene until the preliminary investigation is complete. And then the body will be taken to the morgue by the medical examiner or coroner for what they call a post-mortem examination or autopsy. And a lot of times, again, that first officer on the scene, the reason that they're wanting to determine the path to the victim is because as medical personnel arrive, their job is to save individuals and render aid. They don't really care as much about your crime scene as you do. Sometimes they do, but typically they don't. So a good rule of thumb here is to find that pathway, and you can guide the medical personnel in. Does that make sense? So they're not stepping all over the scene. There's one single pathway going into that scene. So how do you determine then that death has occurred? So medically, death is determined by the cessation of three vital functions: heartbeat, respiration, and brain activity. Now, the first two of those signs are visible because you can't see somebody's brain activity, but you can see heartbeat and you can see respiration. So the cessation or stoppage, if you will, of respiration is generally the first visible sign of death, which means that you can see that there is no more. However, in cases such as barbiturate overdose or something similar, sometimes breathing can be so shallow that you really can't see it. It's undetectable. Therefore, it's always a good rule to check for a heartbeat and a pulse as well. Don't just go in and go, oh, I don't see them breathing, so they must be deceased. Now, except in some drug overdoses with certain types of blindness, failure of the pupils to dilate in reaction to light is also a sign of death. If the victim appears to have died at the moment of the officer's arrival or dies in the officer's presence, you of course would want to attempt some type of resuscitative medical treatment, such as standard CPR, etc. Right? So that kind of only makes sense. So again, signs of death include things like lack of breathing, lack of heartbeat, again, eye movement, the reaction to pupils. So different things like that. And then, so after you've determined that, we're going to talk a little bit about securing and documenting the scene. So as with any other criminal investigation, the homicide scene must be secured, photographed, and sketched. Now, videotaping the crime scene can also produce excellent results, and it really is being done more frequently. All evidence must be obtained, identified, and properly preserved. Remember that physical evidence can be found on the body, at the scene, or on the suspect. And it's always easier when you're talking about crime scenes unless the scene is in a room. If it's outside, remember, we talked about this in other chapters. It's better to make the crime scene larger at first because you can always bring it in smaller. The issue is going to be if you make it small, oftentimes it's too late. Things have been contaminated and you can't really make it larger. So understand that. So what about collecting and moving the body? So after the entire scene and the evidence have been photographed and sketched, move the body carefully. And you're going to do this with typically with the coroner there or a coroner tech. So you're going to want to lift it a few inches off of the surface and slide typically either a plastic or a white sheet under it to catch any evidence that may fall while transporting the body to the vehicle. And the coroner, again, is going to help you do this, or they will do it for you. Now, evidence on the body that falls off is much easier to see if it's on a sheet. And a sheet also absorbs moisture, but again, it could be a plastic sheet. And also, place a clean brown paper bag or bags on the victim's hands and their feet and secure them for transport to preserve any evidence that may exist on their hands or their feet, right? And that kind of makes sense. What if they scratch someone and they have some skin or some particles under their fingernails? You don't want to lose that. What if they fired a weapon before they were killed and they might have gunshot residue on their hands? So you're going to want to do what we call bag their hands and feet to preserve any of that evidence. And then, of course, you're going to itemize other possessions and send them along with the body to the morgue for later release to the family if they are not evidence. You don't send evidence to the morgue. That you're going to process. You'll have your evidence tech or your crime scene tech process and take all of that. So what really then is the focus of the homicide investigation before we really kind of jump into some very specific aspects? So after priority matters are completed, the focus of the homicide investigation is to identify the victim, establish the time of death, establish cause of and the method used to produce death, and then develop a suspect. And the preliminary investigation either accomplishes these things or is going to provide leads that investigators can follow up, which we hope will provide all of those points that I just covered. All right, so now we're going to kind of turn our focus to the homicide victim. So in most cases, or in most crimes, the victim provides verbal details of what occurred. In homicides, the victim, of course, may not be able to provide such information if witnesses or the police are present before death occurs. However, the information usually comes from the crime scene, witnesses, physical evidence, and circumstantial evidence, and the suspect. So again, in most crimes, the victim is going to provide verbal details of what occurred. In homicides, that's not going to be the case. So that other information that you need, because it's not coming from the victim directly verbally, is going to come from the crime scene itself, from the witnesses that you interview, from the physical evidence, and even from the suspect that you may interrogate. So again, that's kind of, as it relates to the victim, we're talking about the importance. Now, in some cases, there may not be a body present. It may have been burned. It may have been cut up beyond recognition, or it may have even been dissolved in acid. So some states will allow for the use of what we call circumstantial evidence to prove the corpus delicti, or the elements, when no body can be found. And I have a really cool video. It's probably 20 to 25 minutes long, and the title's called No Corpus Delicti, and it'll help you understand what corpus delicti means. People think, I mean, it literally means the body of the crime, but it doesn't mean the actual, like, physical body. It means those pieces, those elements in order to establish the crime. So one piece of corpus delicti for homicide needs to be death or harm. You have to be able to establish it. So if you don't have a body, how do you establish that? But the courts have said we can use circumstantial evidence. So we don't necessarily need the body. So super interesting, right? Or at least I think it is. Okay, kind of moving on. So if we have a body, once a body is found, it must be identified. And that kind of makes sense. So homicide victims are typically identified by immediate family, relatives, friends, acquaintances, sometimes personal effects, fingerprints, DNA analysis, dental and skeletal studies, clothing and laundry marks, or even through missing person files. Now, in many cases, identifying the deceased is really no problem. The spouse, parents, a close friend, or a relative will be able to make the identification. Now, if possible, it is good to have a couple of people make the identification just so there's no mistake, because people are emotional and you don't want to make the mistake and say that someone's been identified as being deceased and it's not the right person. So, but there's a lot of other scientific ways that we can identify someone as well. So next would be, we need to estimate the time of death. So in many homicides, there is a delay between the commission of the crime and the discovery of the body. Now, sometimes it's only minutes, and other times it could be years. And this period between death and the discovery of the body is called the post-mortem interval, or they call it PMI. And understanding that process that occurs in a body during that gap, or that PMI, can really help investigators estimate a time of death. So the time of death relates directly to whether the suspect could have been at the scene and to the sequence of multiple deaths. It is also important to the victim's family in settling insurance claims and Social Security and even pension payments. So a time of death that is less than 1/2 hour before examination is normally the easiest determination to make. The body is still warm. Mucous membranes are still moist, but drying. Blood is still moist, but it's kind of drying. The pupils have started to dilate. And in very fair-skinned individuals, the skin starts to get a little bit pale. And this characteristic of recent death becomes less discernible as the skin pigmentation starts to increase. So that's when we talk about less than 1/2 hour, it is the easiest. Now, what about death that's occurred 1/2 hour to, let's say, 4 days prior? And this is a lot of times you'll stumble across these types of cases as well. So generally, if the death occurred within the past 4 days, but more than 1/2 hour ago, mucous membranes and any blood from the wounds are typically dry. There are skin blisters and a little bit of slippage, and the body is slightly pink. Body temperature tends to drop. Rigor mortis and post-mortem lividity are present, and the pupils are restricted and somewhat cloudy. So these are basically some of the characteristics of a body that's 1/2 hour to 4 days old. Now, to kind of help you with a couple of quick definitions, and then we'll take a quick break. Rigor mortis, this is where the body is limp after death until this thing called rigor mortis sets in. And it's the Latin term, and it actually means stiffness in death. And it's a stiffening of the joints of the body after death due to partial skeletal muscle contraction caused by chemical changes in muscle fibers. And the onset of this may occur anywhere from 10 minutes to several hours post-mortem, depending on the physical conditions concerning the body and the environment. So that's rigor mortis, and you can see it's kind of the stiffening. Now, post-mortem lividity is a little bit different, and so this is when the heart stops beating at death. The blood no longer circulates, and therefore gravity drains the blood to the body's lowest points, and that kind of makes sense, right? And this causes a dark blue or purple discoloration of the body called post-mortem lividity. Sometimes you've probably heard it called liver mortis. Now, lividity is kind of a cherry red or strong pink if death has been caused by carbon monoxide poisoning or various other poisons. So if a body is on its back, lividity appears in the lower portion of the back and legs. If face down, it appears on the face, chest, and stomach and legs. And if the body is on its side, lividity will appear on the side in which the body is resting. And if the body is upright, it appears in the buttocks and lower leg area. So one other note, and you'll see it in the pictures here. Any part of the body pressing directly on a hard surface does not show lividity because the pressure of the body's weight prevents the blood from entering the blood vessels in that area. If blood has been released from large wounds, very little, if any, lividity might occur. But for you to know is that, again, if the body is resting up against something, you'll see that it's kind of just, it's not the pink or the really dark red or the purple as here. Okay. All right, so we've gone a little bit over and we've talked about quite a bit of things. So we're going to go ahead and stop here and we're going to take our first break. So this will conclude part 1 of our Chapter 8 lecture on death investigation. So we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back.